Atari decided to resurrect one of the most mocked franchises of the 90s, and instead of handing it to a major studio with a heavy budget, they dropped the responsibility into the lap of Fabras, a relatively small indie developer. But small doesn't mean inexperienced, because Fabras is the studio behind Demon Turf. And anyone familiar with that game knows these guys have a deep understanding of how to make 3D platforming actually work. What makes the development context even curious is that Fabras didn't approach this project with arrogance. They publicly admitted they were basically pressured by the community and Atari itself to take on the challenge. This creates an interesting development energy because you have a team that didn't choose the character out of blind love for the franchise, but clearly decided, upon accepting the job, to make something that justified the project's existence. There is a huge difference between developing out of contractual obligation and developing to prove a point. One of the most striking development decisions Fabras made was their clear stance against using generative AI in the project. They communicated this publicly at a time when much of the industry is heading in the opposite direction, cutting costs with Gen AI in art, writing, and sound design. This isn't just a technical choice, it's a philosophical statement about how the studio views the creative process. And in a game where the main character is exactly the kind of thing AI would likely generate with ease, this choice carries even greater symbolic weight. The design of Bubsy's moveset in this new entry also reveals a lot about the development mindset. Gliding, climbing walls with claws, pounce attacks, and entering a high-speed mode aren't mechanics randomly thrown onto a character. They are the result of a creative process where the team clearly studied what makes modern 3D platformers work and built the gameplay from the inside out, starting with what the character could be mechanically before thinking about what he was historically. The aesthetic choice of cell shading also tells a development story. Fabras could have bet on a realistic look to try and impress with technology, but they chose a handcrafted, colorful, and exaggerated style that speaks directly to the nonsense tone of the Bubsy universe. This decision didn't happen by chance. It demonstrates that there was a real conversation within the studio about visual identity and how to create something with its own personality instead of just following market trends. The fact that the project includes fully voiced 3D cutscenes also says a lot about the level of commitment. This is expensive, hard-working, and unnecessary if the goal was just to release a quick product to capitalize on nostalgia. Fabras clearly worked with a level of ambition above what anyone would expect from an indie title carrying this name. It's not the kind of choice a studio makes when they're just going through the motions. An honest indie studio, no AI, with a real love for the craft of 3D platforming, carrying a character the entire industry had discarded. Regardless of the final result, the context behind this development is already, in itself, one of the most interesting stories in the platforming scene in recent years. The premise itself isn't revolutionary, and I'd argue it doesn't need to be. Bubsy is now traveling through space, facing off against the so-called bots, and trying to recover the famous golden yarn. Yes, the usual yarn. It's a simple setup, almost as if the developer is saying, "Look, we know you didn't come here for narrative depth." On one hand, I respect that honesty. On the other, I wonder if this is a crutch to avoid committing to anything. What caught my attention was the way Fabras is using the character's own history as part of the narrative. They brought back a character named Oblivia, who only existed in the failed pilot episode of an animated series from the 90s. This is a level of research and care I didn't expect. It's not just a generic reboot. There is someone there who actually dug through the franchise's dusty archives. Even so, the story creates an interesting paradox. The official statement itself begins with Bubsy saying, "It's no secret I have a questionable track record." It's self-aware, even funny the first time you read it. But then you stop and think, Is the game's narrative going to depend on this self-referential humor the whole time? Because this kind of resource has an expiration date. It works in a trailer, it works in marketing, but if it's the emotional crutch for the entire journey, it will get tiring fast. Playing the demo, the first 3 levels give a taste of how this story will be structured in space. Each world has a handcrafted theme, a visual style called cell shading, and ends with a Bobot boss battle. It works mechanically, I must admit. Exploration has that collectathon vibe, like Banjo-Kazooie, which makes you want to understand what each planet has to offer in terms of lore and context. It's an invitation to curiosity, even if the background plot is thin. What really concerns me is the long-term depth of the story. Developer Rastifer mentioned that the approach was to create a move set that is easy to learn but difficult to master. Great for gameplay, but was the same philosophy applied to the narrative? Because a game that raises questions about the redemption of a failed character, using that as an emotional hook, needs to deliver something beyond jokes and themed planets. The self-awareness needs to evolve into something genuine at some point in the campaign. The story of Bubsy 4D is the best version of a Bubsy story that has ever existed. It embraces the past without sinking in it, uses the franchise's mythology intelligently with references like Oblivia, and at least knows how to laugh at itself. But it still lacks that moment where you stop and think, this actually matters. If Fabraz can build that in the levels the demo didn't show, Bubsy might finally justify his own existence.
Look, I need to admit something before any judgment. I went into this demo expecting to suffer. It's almost a conditioned reflex when you mention the name Bubsy and gameplay in the same sentence. But then you start playing, and at some point in the first few minutes, you stop and think, wait, this is actually working. It's not perfect, but it's working. And that in itself is a historic achievement for this franchise. Bubsy's movement is the heart of everything, and Fabraz spent a lot of time here. You have a double jump with that hover at the end, like Yoshi in Super Mario World, the usual glide, a pounce that locks onto enemies, wall climbing, and the hairball mode, which transforms Bubsy into a ball of fur that speeds down ramps. There are many options. It feels like someone finally decided that Bubsy deserved a real movement kit. But where things start to crack is precisely in this abundance of moves. Hairball mode, for example, is fun on paper, but when the game asks you to switch between rolling slowly and rolling fast in sequence, things fall apart. You release the button, the character stops, and then you have to gain speed again from scratch, with no transition animation, no feeling of momentum buildup. It's a detail that seems small, but when the level design forces you to do it repeatedly, it starts to get quite annoying. The glide has a similar problem. It's an ability that existed in the franchise since the first game, and I expected it to be improved here. But when you enter the glide, Bubsy falls too fast, as if someone tied an anchor to his paw. It would be very useful for adjusting alignment on distant platforms, but as it stands, it completely loses its function. It works well in theory, but fails in practice. And the worst part is that the pounce does what the glide should do, making the ability almost redundant. What genuinely surprises is the overall speed of the game. You can blast through levels at ridiculous speeds, and the camera struggles to keep up. Speedrunners will love this. The Taz community must be drooling. But for those exploring for the first time, especially during Bobot boss fights, this speed can work against you. The sense of control exists, but there's that gray area where the game goes a bit too fast to be totally precise. The level design of the 3 worlds in the demo shows an interesting philosophy. The levels have that collectathon structure. You collect yarn, find secrets, and explore vertically. It's the language of Banjo-Kazooie and Spyro, translated for 2025, and it works well with the movement in general. However, at times, the levels seem to have been built before the movements were fully refined, because certain sections demand precision that the physics don't yet consistently deliver. The time trials in the demo are where this is most evident.
On balance, the gameplay in Bubsy 4DD is good. That's not a sentence I expected to write, but it's honest. Fabraz managed to do what two previous Resurrection games couldn't: create a Bubsy that is fun to control. Flaws exist. The glide needs adjustment, hairball mode needs a transition, the camera needs more breathing room, but the core is solid. And with the right fixes by launch, this could be the character's best game without being even close.
There are moments while playing the demo where you stop in the middle of a level, completely forget this is a Bubsy game, and just admire the environment. That wasn't something I expected to feel. When Fabraz showed the first images during the Gamescom announcement, I thought it was just clever marketing, that screenshot treatment that makes any game look better than it is. But playing it, the visuals hold up. The game actually looks good. The visual style was a very wise decision. Fabraz chose a modern 3D cartoon cell shading without trying to imitate realism or look like something it's not. It's a vibrant aesthetic with colors that pop off the screen, and there's a wisdom behind this choice that goes beyond aesthetic taste. This style ages well. 10 years from now, this game will still look consistent with its visual proposal. Bubsy 3D tried to do serious 3D for its time and aged horribly. Here, Fabraz played it safe in the smartest sense of the word. The planet design in the demo is where the visuals truly shine. Each world has a handcrafted theme with textures that look like fabric, felt, yarn, and handmade materials. Visually, this creates a very strong identity, a world where everything feels like it was built with a needle and thread in outer space. It's a cohesive idea, and you feel that the art designers had a clear vision of what they wanted. It's not just pretty for the sake of being pretty. There's an internal logic that makes sense within the game's universe. Bubsy himself was redesigned with care. The character animations have that 90s cartoon exaggeration with modern fluidity, and the outfits you can unlock in the in-game shop had extra personality without breaking visual coherence. The fully animated 3D cutscenes with voice acting were a real surprise to me. I didn't expect this level of production in an indie franchise Resurrection. The character has expressions and animation timing. It looks like someone actually spent time animating it with care. But not everything is perfect on the visual front. There are moments when the camera works against the graphics. At high speeds, especially in hairball mode, the environment passes by too fast for you to appreciate the visual details of the levels. Fabraz built worlds with visual personality, but sometimes the game's own pace prevents you from seeing it all. It's a pacing issue that ends up affecting the visual perception of the experience as a whole. The graphics in Bubsy 4D are one of the strongest points of the project. Fabraz proved with Demon Turf that they know how to create a strong and distinct visual identity, and here they scaled that ability for a franchise character with heavy historical baggage. The result is a game that has its own face, using the cartoon style not as an easy choice, but as an artistic statement. This, along with the well-produced cutscenes, elevates the game far above what anyone would expect from a new Bubsy. Performance is one of those things you only truly feel once you get your hands on the game. You can have the most beautiful visuals in the world and the most engaging story, but if the game freezes, stutters, or simply doesn't respond as it should, everything falls apart. And playing the Bubsy 4D demo, performance was exactly where things got most complicated for me. It wasn't a disaster, but there were red flags I can't ignore. The first problem that jumps out is the camera. This is the #1 villain of the game's perceived performance. When you enter hairball mode and start rolling at maximum speed, the camera simply doesn't keep up. It lags behind, clips through walls, and loses Bubsy from the frame for fractions of a second. In a game clearly built for speedrunners and people who like to go fast, a camera with this behavior is almost an internal contradiction. It's like building a racetrack and putting a speed bump on the main straight. On PC, the technical performance situation was even more evident. The demo ran with notable stutters on hardware without a dedicated graphics card, and even lowering the graphical settings, the game showed frame rate instability in certain situations. The strangest thing is that the cell shading visual style, by nature, shouldn't be as demanding as it is. When a game with a cartoon aesthetic feels heavier than it looks like it should, it indicates there is still optimization work in the queue before the final release. On console versions, the story was different and more positive. On PlayStation 5, the demo was rated an average of 4.25 stars by players, and DualSense compatibility, including vibration and trigger effects, was correctly implemented. However, even the Nintendo Switch and Switch 2 required a stability improvement update after the demo's launch. In other words, even on console versions, Fabraz acknowledged there was instability to resolve. What concerns me is the timing. The demo was released in October 2025, and as late as April 2026, Fabraz was still releasing stability updates for the updated console versions of the demo. This means they are actively working on the problems, which is positive, but it also means that more than 6 months after the first demo, performance issues were still present enough to justify fixes. As the release window approaches, will it be fully polished? That's the question that remains. On balance, the performance of Bubsy 4D in the demo is at a stage I would call functional but unfinished. The game doesn't break, it doesn't crash, and it isn't the technical horror Bubsy 3D was in its day. But the camera, PC optimization, and inconsistencies between platforms are real issues that affect the experience. Fabraz demonstrated with Demon Turf that they know how to deliver a polished product, so there is confidence they will resolve this before launch. But I'll need to see a final build before declaring that the performance is up to the level of the rest of what the game offers. Bubsy 4D will launch on May 22, 2026 for $19.99, and this information changes everything when you start calculating if it's worth buying at launch. At a higher price point, I would have serious doubts, given the franchise's history and the performance issues the demo still showed. But $20 is a number that puts the game in a different category, where imperfections are easier to swallow if the core product is fun. And according to the demo, the core product is fun. The demo has 92% positive reviews on Steam with nearly 500 reviews recorded. That number isn't for nothing. It's not blind hype from Bubsy fans, because Bubsy fans are a rare species. It's people who arrived skeptical, played, and left surprised. I'm in that group. You play that demo expecting suffering and find a 3D platformer with its own visual identity, layered movement, and level design that invites exploration. That's already worth something, and the $19.99 price point is well aligned with that delivery. Performance issues haven't been fully resolved yet. Up until April 2026, Fabraz was still releasing stability updates for the updated console demo. This means polishing work is ongoing, and the real question is whether these issues will be resolved when the full game reaches your hands on the 22nd. There's no way to know that now. And a game that arrives with stutters and a confusing camera on launch day will be frustrating, regardless of the price. The game is certainly recommended for those who grew up in the golden age of 90s and 2000s collectathons. If you have fond memories of Banjo-Kazooie, Spyro, or Crash Bandicoot, Bubsy 4D is speaking directly to you. The game uses the same language of exploration, collection, and discovery that made those classics work. It's also recommended for those who enjoy speed running, because the structure of the time trials and the speed allowed by hairball mode open up a huge space for that type of play. That said, I wouldn't recommend it to those expecting a platformer with a deep narrative or high difficulty. Bubsy 4D seems to be a game with a laid-back vibe, self-aware humor, and satisfying exploration, but without the depth of a Mario Odyssey or a Hat in Time. If you need a challenge or want a story that grips you emotionally, this game will likely leave you wanting more. But if you want something enjoyable to play without heavy demands, it delivers.
And for those who have no connection to the franchise and are coming into the story fresh, that's the audience I'd be more hesitant to recommend it to on launch day. The demo showed enough to say the game works, but the full game is still an unknown in terms of length, world variety, and whether the camera and performance issues were solved. For this player profile, waiting 2 weeks after launch to see the first full reviews is the smartest move. As for me, I'm buying it at launch, not with blind hype, but with a calculated optimism that the demo justified. $20 for what Fabraz has shown so far is a risk I'm willing to take. The developer has a track record of delivering quality games with Demon Turf, and the care they are bringing to this franchise resurrection is visible in every detail, from referencing forgotten characters from canceled cartoons to correctly implementing DualSense features. It might turn out to be a gem or a good but imperfect product. Either way, for the asking price, it's worth the bet.
Drowning in responsibilities and